Let's talk about the Texas budget, why it matters, and what we can do. As Marika shared, the Texas budget is a huge part. It's actually the thing that the legislature has to pass during session. If they don't do anything else, that's okay, but they cannot walk away without passing a budget. And so this is hugely important. So let's look at some of the numbers around the budget that really show to what Marika was sharing around the size of Texas and the influence we have. The size of stated Texas economy, 1.8 trillion. The size of the Texas budget from 2019 was 250 billion. And then number of Texans in our state, 29 million. And so it's a lot of money for a lot of people. And there's a lot of things that people are wanting to prioritize and arguments that can happen that we can definitely do our part in advocating for. So looking at the top categories from the budget, we can see that the top 7 categories make up 83% of that budget, which the actual technical amount looks like it's 247 billion. The top 2 areas within these are K through 12 education and healthcare, each of them representing about $60 billion of the budget. So a lot of the conversations you always hear every legislative session is around education and healthcare because they're the top 2 items in our budget, the most expensive. So people think, well, if we need to make adjustments or if we want to have tax cuts for people, or if we want to do that, well, let's target those 2 big things and make adjustments there. And we've seen that, this is actually, even though they are very large part of the budget, we continually need more investment, as we saw with the last legislative cycle with HB3 passing for an increase in public education funding. So these are the things that help the infrastructure in Texas be what it is. So the budget is all about sustaining and helping improve the infrastructure. At least that's what our goal is, versus trying to strip it down, which we've had to see happen, unfortunately, at various times. What are we looking at for this year for the budget? So these graphics are from Donna Howard, Texas State Rep out of District 48. Some of these numbers have been updated, so I want to talk through these a little bit. But in July, the Texas Comptroller had said that there was going to be a $4.6 billion budget shortfall, which isn't the largest shortfall we've ever had, but it is significant due to the pandemic. Recently, the Comptroller has indicated that that shortfall is not as dire as they were predicting, that there has been increased economic activity the second half of this year, and the next revenue information that comes from the Comptroller will be January 11th, the day before sessions start. We'll get those actual numbers once they're reported, but they're looking at that $4.6 billion not going to be, it's not going to be that size that they were seeing originally in the middle of the year. But there are things that we can offset any shortfall that we may have. And the 3 key areas that we have are the Rainy Day Fund, formerly actually known as the Economic Stabilization Fund. There's about 8.8 billion in there. There's federal funds from the CARES Act. Donna's original publication of this was 5.7 billion, but just recently this last week, we got an update that there's about $2 billion and we have about a month still left to spend it. And that's from the Houston Public Media, that little top headline that we have there. And then the other option is Medicaid expansion, which gives an estimated $10 billion return of state tax dollars. And there has been more talk around Medicaid expansion, the potential to talk about it, to negotiate about it. One of the talking points we continue to hear around Medicaid expansion is the state's portion. Even though it's 1 out of every $10 that the state would have to essentially be a part of contributing, that's still a lot of concern for a lot of representatives and senators, that there's some negotiation and conversations that need to happen around that. But the idea of Medicaid expansion is becoming much more mainstream than it has been previously. So let's talk about the Rainy Day Fund really quick. What is the Rainy Day Fund? It was established in 1987. Oil prices hit record highs in 1979. The legislative session after that was excited and really spent all that money. But then when oil prices collapsed in the early to mid 80s, the legislative session after that really had to deal with that collapse in oil and gas prices. And so the Rainy Day Fund was introduced as a plan to help Texas save through those times where we have great surpluses and we have great economic activity, so that it can help us through those times and we may not have as much. And so it's been an important part of helping Texas, be stable through these ups and downs of our economy. If we look at the history of the Rainy Day Fund, the first 10 years, there was not as much withdrawals and deposits, activity. But then if you look after 2000, there's been a lot of activity in terms of the Rainy Day Fund. Definitely much more deposits than there have been withdrawals. But one thing that I want to point out is the largest withdrawal that we had in 2011 was $3.2 billion after the Great Recession, to be able to address those shortfalls, which was much larger than the shortfall we're seeing right now. We're in the double digits of shortfall, billions of dollars that we had to deal with during that time. Sometimes you can hear the narrative is, well, we don't touch the Rainy Day Fund. We should never touch the Rainy Day Fund and things like that. And this just kind of shows the history that, yes, we have tapped the Rainy Day Fund and we can. And so it is a viable option that we could look at if we feel like the shortfall can be addressed with the Rainy Day Fund. So how does the budget work? Well, significant budget funding comes from state sales tax, which is why the Comptroller is able to say it's not looking as dire because there's been increased economic activity. But it is a problem when state sales tax is a major portion of your revenue, because a recession, as we've seen, and now a pandemic really does impact our ability to budget for the future and really budget for the things to help improve Texans. The every 2-year cycle that we have is also problematic because we can't always predict everything that's going to happen. We surely did not predict a pandemic during the 2019 legislative session. That's where we need to look at what are some of the things that we can do to help stabilize. So the process itself is a 2-year process, as we've mentioned. Really, right now in December, we are ending the last part of the first half of the process. In the even years, which we are now, it's actually in January and April is the starting point of this budget process. And it goes through January through April as the strategic plans are developed. April through June, the legislative appropriation requests are initiated. And then June through September, there's budget hearings conducted, reconciliations, and right now the governor and the LBB, the Legislative Budget Board, start making recommendations, which we'll dive here into a second. And then once the legislative session starts, it's really about getting the budget prepared for after this current budget ends in 2021. That's really trying to get the funds prepared and what we need to forecast, what we're going to need to do. And this really impacts bills that have been passed in the last legislative sessions because, a lot of times we increase funding like we did with HB3 with education, but it doesn't mean that funding is going to sustain itself or that funding is going to stay there. And so going through this budget cycle, it's also making sure that we keep the funds for the bills that we've passed and the spending that we've done so that we can continue to see the progress that we want in these various areas, whether it's highways or whether it's education or healthcare. And that's a big thing that people may not understand, is that just because a bill passed, it doesn't mean that the funding is guaranteed throughout the work that needs to be done. The Legislative Budget Board. Well, we are really privileged here at Indivisible TX Lege because in our audience is Robert Norris. I'm looking forward to getting a recap from Robert on this presentation because he is our budget expert and he used to work with the Legislative Budget Board for several decades and has really helped inform us on how that process goes and what kind of information is available. And we continue to want to get that information out to everybody so they can understand the impact of the Legislative Budget Board. But essentially, they have a wide range of responsibilities that are intended to serve the fiscal policy and analysis needs of the Texas Legislature. When bills are being proposed or when budgets are being formed, the Legislative Budget Board is really the staff. They're the experts who are able to help inform legislators and agencies around what can be done with the funds that are available and what the revenue that has come in, what that means for them. Every 2 years, they have a fiscal size up, which is an over 600-page document that really reports on the budget and other fiscal actions of each legislature session. They're a huge resource that we'll be referencing a lot during the legislative session, and Robert will be a key partner in helping us translate that to everybody. Definitely keep an eye on them. You can see the budget hearings that they've had in November and December. That's available on their website. Another great resource in terms of the budget is Texas Comptroller updates. They have a monthly newsletter called Fiscal Notes. And the Texas Comptroller's Fiscal Notes newsletter really does a great job of diving into various aspects of the economy that help inform Texans and as well as leaders in Texas around the different problematic areas, whether it's revenue or expenses or whatever it is. One thing that's really interesting is in October, there was a whole newsletter focused on uninsured Texans and the impact of uninsured Texans on the long-term negative impacts on our economy because people don't have health insurance. So one of the talking points we actually heard during the Texas Tribune virtual symposium this last week was the expenses of the state portion of Medicaid expansion. And, are we ready to take on that expense, and how can we navigate that? And really the Fiscal Notes newsletter, it talks about we're already paying that cost and we're paying that cost in a much bigger way. These are some of the talking points we can utilize when we're talking to legislators. Once again, it's maybe a little surprising to us that there's a lot of progressive issues that we care about that are out in the open and being talked about. And this is the information that's available. So every month, be on the lookout for the Fiscal Notes, a really great resource. So what are legislators doing right now? Well, legislators are really doing some things differently than we've seen before. Senator Jane Nelson is the chair of the Finance Committee and one of the most powerful people in the legislature. And she actually happens to be my senator here in Fort Worth. And she did something very curious at the beginning of November, which she went on Twitter and she open sourced to constituents asking, what do you see as the most pressing issues our budget needs to address? This is not very common to see Senator Nelson do this or a lot of legislators in Texas. So I think that what this tells us is that legislators are going to be more open and available for us to communicate to them in various ways during this session than maybe what we've seen previously. Everyone's used to bombarding the Capitol and there being a lot of activity there. A lot of meetings are being held. And sometimes, that's what the norm is. But the pandemic has shown us that we need to change some of those norms. And we may not even have access to the Capitol as we're used to. The opportunities to be able to connect with legislators in various platforms and various ways is going to be very important. And then also Senator Representative Gary Van Diver out of North Texas, he's a Republican and a former school administrator, talked about making good and finding a permanent revenue source of HB3, which was the increase of school, finding the portion that the state provides for public education. This is just an important thing to continue to emphasize. Not every bill that's passed is guaranteed the funding in order to implement the things that the bill has in it. HB3 being as important as it is for public education, the need to find a permanent revenue source is something that we see with bills that are passed. And then what we see from one legislative session to the next is like, oh, well, we passed this law. Oh, nothing happened. Look, it hasn't been improved, so let's just cut it the next session. Well, the funds may not have been there. There may not have been time to implement everything. And that's one of the tactics and tricks that some legislators like to use so that they can prevent this kind of progress from happening. So what can we do? Well, number one is take action now. Contact your local school board, your county commissioners, and even your mayor, your city council. Learn about the support they need from the state budget. What are the elements that are most important for them to be able to support the local community that you're in? The second thing is contact your state reps then. Introduce yourself and ask how they will support the budget based on the feedback you got from your local leaders. Really, that connection piece is a lot of work that we can do because there's really three elements to our budget. There's the federal funds, the state portion, and there's the local funds from property taxes and such. And that balance is very fragile. And if one of those are out of sync or not working well with the others, it really puts the whole system in shambles. And so that communication is something that we can deliver. And then stay informed. Indivisible TX Lege will continue to work with advocates and partners to provide great resources and budget information that we're aligned on. You can follow our website for updates and information, join our newsletter, sign up for that, be a part of our organizing team as well so that we can continue to get more information out to Texans. One thing that we've been doing this fall is we've done Facebook Live, YouTube Live sessions, And that's going to be something that you're going to see a lot of during the legislative session, so that we can continue to highlight. So following our Facebook page and social media is going to be a great opportunity.